Does the president have any plans on making a proclamation, or is it just going to be June this year?
Well, there are no plans for a proclamation for the month of June, but I can tell you this president is very proud to be a president for all Americans, regardless of race, religion, or creed.
As cities across the nation lit up in rainbow colors and communities came together to celebrate Pride Month, one institution remained conspicuously silent: the White House behind the closed doors of power. The Trump administration's lack of recognition for Pride Month was not merely an oversight, it was a calculated decision, part of a broader strategy that many argue undermined years of progress for LGBTQ+ rights in America. In this in-depth report, we explore the quiet but deliberate dismantling of symbolic and policy support for LGBTQ+ communities during the Trump era. The absence of White House Pride proclamations under Trump was more than symbolic. It underscored a larger ideological shift within the federal executive. During Pride Month in 2019, after 2 years of complete silence, the White House issued a brief tweet recognizing LGBTQ+ contributions. However, no formal proclamation was made, and the president did not host or attend any pre-dated events. What followed further widened the chasm between public LGBTQ celebration and federal recognition. Several U.S. embassies under Trump's State Department were explicitly barred from flying the Pride flag on official flagpoles, despite their own local observances and advocacy abroad. The decision contradicted long-standing tradition and sent a stark diplomatic message. Embassies in countries such as Brazil, Germany, and Israel requested permission to fly the rainbow flag alongside the American flag in solidarity with LGBTQ+ rights during Pride Month, while under the Obama administration such gestures were not only approved but encouraged. Trump's State Department issued denials. Career diplomats were left in the awkward position of either complying or finding alternative ways to display solidarity, such as hanging banners inside embassy walls or posting statements on social media. For many, the restrictions reflected a broader dissonance between individual values within the Foreign Service and the administration's directives from Washington. Back on U.S. soil, federal agencies grew increasingly quiet on LGBTQ+ initiatives. The Department of Education, under Secretary Betsy DeVos, rolled back guidance that had previously supported transgender students' access to facilities aligned with their gender identity. The Department of Housing and Urban Development removed protections for transgender individuals seeking emergency shelter, particularly vulnerable LGBTQ+ youth who disproportionately rely on such housing. At the same time, health regulations were revised to allow medical professionals to deny care based on moral or religious beliefs, a move that disproportionately endangered LGBTQ+ patients, especially transgender individuals. In June 2020, amidst national unrest over racial injustice and a looming pandemic, Pride Month arrived with even less federal acknowledgement. But that same month, the U.S. Supreme Court delivered a landmark decision. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 would now protect employees from discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. While the ruling was celebrated nationwide as a monumental legal victory, the White House's response was tepid. President Trump, when asked about the decision, said it was very powerful, but offered no further elaboration or support. No statement was issued from the White House celebrating the progress. For LGBTQ Americans, the silence echoed louder than words. Meanwhile, in conservative circles aligned with the administration, anti-LGBTQ rhetoric gained new platforms. Figures such as Vice President Mike Pence, known for past opposition to same-sex marriage and LGBTQ protections, held influence over domestic policy. Organizations such as the Family Research Council and Alliance Defending Freedom, both designated as anti-LGBTQ+. Hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center enjoyed access to the administration through advisory roles or private meetings. Their lobbying efforts bore fruit in judicial appointments and policy revisions, embedding long-term ideological footprints within federal institutions. Throughout Trump's term, dozens of federal judges were appointed to lifetime positions on the bench, many with records opposing LGBTQ rights. These confirmations, pushed through by Senate Republicans, were hailed by religious conservatives as a generational victory. For LGBTQ advocates, however, It marked the slow entrenchment of conservative legal doctrine in cases concerning civil liberties, healthcare access, education, and workplace protections. These appointments were strategic, intended to outlast political cycles and influence interpretations of the law. For decades, even military policies reflected the administration's stance. In 2017, President Trump announced, via Twitter, that transgender individuals would no longer be allowed to serve in the U.S. military. The announcement caught Pentagon officials off guard and sparked legal challenges. But the policy was eventually implemented in 2019, barring most transgender individuals from enlisting or continuing service unless they met specific criteria. The move reversed the Obama administration's earlier efforts to make military service more inclusive and was widely condemned by veterans, groups, and human rights organizations. The cumulative effect of these actions during Pride Month and throughout Trump's presidency painted a clear picture. While the administration rarely engaged in overt homophobic rhetoric, its silence, policy reversals, and judicial appointments collectively amounted to what critics called a silent war on LGBTQ visibility and rights. It was a strategy of omission, allowing others to fill the silence with policy, ideology, and precedent. LGBTQ+ Americans were not directly attacked in primetime speeches, but the infrastructure of support built over previous decades was steadily dismantled. Perhaps the clearest representation of this posture was the 2020 Republican National Convention, which made virtually no mention of LGBTQ+ Americans or the strides made in civil rights over the past 2 decades. Instead, the message was one of traditional values, religious liberty, and nationalism. LGBTQ+ Republicans who had supported Trump in 2016 found themselves increasingly isolated, with groups like Log Cabin Republicans facing backlash even within their own coalition. Their attempts to promote a more inclusive conservatism clashed with the administration's quiet retreat from equality, even as Pride celebrations continued across the nation. Often in defiance of the federal government's silence, the absence of leadership from the highest office in the land was palpable. For a community long accustomed to fighting for recognition, the Trump administration's approach wasn't just about policy, it was about presence. And during 4 consecutive Pride months, that presence was notably absent. Pride Month celebrated annually in June honors the 1969 Stonewall Uprising in Manhattan, a pivotal moment in the LGBTQ rights movement in the United States. Over the decades, what began as grassroots resistance evolved into a global celebration of LGBTQ visibility, resilience, and pride. By the early 2000s, the federal government had begun to formally recognize the month, with President Bill Clinton issuing the first official proclamation in 2000, designating June as Gay and Lesbian Pride Month. His successor, President Barack Obama, expanded this further, declaring it Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Pride Month, and routinely hosting White House events honoring LGBTQ leaders and allies. President Obama's tenure was marked by a series of historic milestones for LGBTQ+ rights: the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the endorsement of same-sex marriage before it became law nationwide, and the appointment of openly gay officials to senior federal positions. The White House under Obama was lit in rainbow colors following the 2015 Supreme Court decision that legalized same-sex marriage nationwide, a powerful symbol of federal recognition and celebration. Government agencies followed suit, with departments such as State, Defense, and Education not only observing Pride Month, but also implementing inclusive policies for LGBTQ+ employees and constituents. When Donald J. Trump assumed office in January 2017, the nation braced for a shift, known for his unpredictable stances and alliances with conservative Christian groups. Trump entered the White House with a track record that included contradictory statements on LGBTQ+ issues. During his campaign, he vowed to fight for the LGBTQ community while simultaneously courting endorsements from figures who had long opposed LGBTQ+ rights. This political duality was one of many warning signs to activists and observers who feared that symbolic gestures of inclusion might give way to silent rollbacks. From the onset, the Trump administration began methodically dismantling policies and cultural acknowledgments related to LGBTQ communities. Among the earliest signs was the quiet erasure of LGBTQ language and resources from federal websites, including the White House, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Department of Labor. Without explanation, pages that once offered guidance, resources, and statements of support vanished, and the administration declined to comment on their removal. In the months that followed, subtle policy changes became more visible. The Justice Department, under Attorney General Jeff Sessions, reversed Obama-era guidance protecting transgender students' rights in public schools. Meanwhile, the Department of Health and Human Services began drafting new definitions of gender aimed at excluding transgender people from civil rights protections under Title IX. While these moves were framed by officials as a return to biological science or religious liberty, critics saw them as direct attacks on the LGBTQ+ community, attacks that gained momentum as each Pride Month came and went without presidential recognition. The silence from the Trump White House during Pride Month became an annual pattern. Unlike his predecessors, President Trump refrained from issuing official proclamations recognizing June as Pride Month during his first 2 years in office. Instead, the administration elevated other causes and observances. In June 2017 and 2018, proclamations were issued for National Homeownership Month, Great Outdoors Month, and Caribbean American Heritage Month. But Pride was conspicuously omitted. The symbolism was clear. Pride, and by extension, LGBTQ Americans, were not part of the administration's official narrative. The muted federal recognition of Pride Month during the Trump presidency did not go unnoticed. Advocacy groups, civil rights organizations, and LGBTQ leaders across the country voiced growing concern over what they called a systematic erasure of LGBTQ+ identity from the national dialogue. GLAAD, Center for Transgender Equality, issued multiple statements, criticizing the administration for both its silence and its rollback of critical protections. They argued that, while past administrations had taken visible steps to recognize LGBTQ+ Americans during Pride Month, the Trump White House's lack of acknowledgement represented a regression in both tone and policy. In 2019, GLAAD released a detailed report cataloging more than 125 anti-LGBTQ+ actions taken by the Trump administration, ranging from regulatory changes to judicial appointments. The report labeled the administration's approach as death by 1,000 cuts, not one singular act of discrimination, but a deliberate series of decisions that cumulatively rolled back decades of progress. The absence of a proclamation isn't the issue in isolation, said GLAAD President Sarah Kate Ellis. It's the larger pattern of exclusion that sends a message that LGBTQ+ Americans are not valued or protected by their government. Prominent political figures also weighed in. Then Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi criticized the administration's refusal to recognize Pride Month, calling it a glaring omission that betrays the dignity and humanity of millions of Americans. Presidential candidates on the 2020 Democratic ticket, including Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, and Elizabeth Warren, highlighted the administration's silence as evidence of its hostility toward marginalized communities. Buttigieg himself, a married gay man and a former military officer, often spoke of the emotional toll such federal silence can have on LGBTQ+ youth seeking validation at the grassroots level. LGBTQ+ communities continued to organize pride parades, and events in major cities such as New York, San Francisco, and Chicago grew in size, often turning into statements of protest against the administration. In Washington, D.C., activists held alternative celebrations and rallies in front of the White House to demand recognition. Chants of "We are here" and "Say our names" reverberated from Lafayette Square, echoing the frustration of a community that felt unseen by its own government. These demonstrations were largely peaceful, but underscored a growing sense of exclusion. Many federal employees also expressed concern over the administration's stance. Anonymous sources within agencies such as the State Department and the Department of Justice reported feeling restricted from participating in Pride-related events or displaying supportive materials in the workplace. An internal memo circulated within the Department of Veterans Affairs in 2018 discouraged displays of the rainbow flag in common areas, citing concerns over neutrality. Critics saw such decisions as a quiet endorsement of exclusion, using bureaucratic language to marginalize vulnerable populations. International leaders took note as well. The German ambassador to the United States, Emily Haber, publicly questioned the decision to block embassies from flying pride flags, calling it a missed opportunity for the U.S. to lead on human rights. Meanwhile, Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, as well as leaders in the UK and the European Union, reaffirmed their commitment to LGBTQ equality and used their platforms to draw contrast. The message abroad was clear. The Trump administration's actions were not aligned with the global movement toward inclusion, despite official silence. Some members of Trump's inner circle did make rare acknowledgments. In 2019, U.S. Ambassador to Germany, Richard Grenell, who is openly gay, launched a global campaign to decriminalize homosexuality in countries where it remained illegal. While praised by some for its diplomatic ambition, critics noted that the campaign lacked meaningful support or funding from the White House. Moreover, Grenell's initiative was not matched by domestic policies, leading to accusations that the campaign was largely symbolic, an attempt to polish an otherwise regressive LGBTQ record. Religious and conservative advocacy groups, many of whom had supported Trump's campaign, celebrated the administration's quiet retreat from LGBTQ+ recognition. The Family Research Council called the absence of a Pride proclamation a return to American values. In their view, the Trump administration had taken necessary steps to protect religious liberty, even if it meant withdrawing recognition of LGBTQ observances. These groups applauded judicial appointments, policy revisions, and the shift in federal language that no longer prioritized LGBTQ concerns. Yet even within conservative circles, there was discomfort. Some younger Republicans and libertarian-leaning voices began advocating for a more inclusive message. Organizations such as Young Conservatives for the Freedom to Marry and the Log Cabin Republicans continued pushing for federal recognition of Pride and broader LGBTQ+ rights. In 2019, Log Cabin Republicans controversially endorsed Trump for re-election, leading to resignations within their ranks and widespread backlash from LGBTQ+ activists who viewed the move as a betrayal for many Americans. The real impact of the Trump administration's stance was felt not in speeches or laws, but in the emotional void it created. For LGBTQ+ youth growing up in rural communities, symbolic gestures like presidential proclamations or flags at embassies are more than just tradition. They're a signal that their country sees and values them. When those signals disappear, the silence speaks volumes. Political analysts and civil rights scholars agree that the Trump administration's quiet dismantling of LGBTQ+ recognition efforts was neither accidental nor merely symbolic. Dr. Jennifer Pizer, Chief Legal Officer at Lambda Legal, described the administration's actions as part of a broader pattern of strategic erasure, one that sought to remove LGBTQ+ identity from federal visibility without the overt backlash of openly discriminatory rhetoric. According to Pizer and other legal experts, this strategy proved highly effective in appeasing the administration's conservative base while avoiding major media uproar that typically accompanies high-profile rollbacks. The long-term implications of such erasure are multifaceted. From a legal perspective, policy decisions that eliminated protections for transgender individuals, undermined non-discrimination rules, or narrowed the definitions of gender and sex in federal law set dangerous precedents. These decisions created legal ambiguity, leaving lower courts and federal agencies divided on how to interpret civil rights laws like Title IX and Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act. The result is a patchwork system of protections, where one's civil rights could vary drastically by geography, political leadership, or agency discretion, a regression from the uniformity sought during the Obama years. Moreover, the administration's judicial appointments are likely to have the longest-lasting effects, with over 200 federal judges confirmed during Trump's term, including 3 Supreme Court justices. The ideological composition of the judiciary has tilted sharply to the right. Many of these judges have histories of opposing LGBTQ+ rights, either through past rulings, affiliations, or personal writings. Their lifetime appointments ensure that even if future administrations seek to restore protections, legal challenges are more likely to be met with skepticism or outright opposition in the courts. Social scientists also point to the cultural impact of federal silence. Dr. Kevin Nadal, a psychologist specializing in LGBTQ+ mental health, noted a rise in reports of anxiety, depression, and marginalization among LGBTQ+ youth during the Trump years. While direct causation is complex, Nadal emphasized that visibility and affirmation from national leaders have a profound psychological impact, especially on marginalized youth. When the federal government recognizes your identity, it affirms your worth, he explained. When it goes silent, it can feel like erasure, like you've been written out of your own country's story. This cultural retreat has also emboldened local and state-level policies that further marginalize LGBTQ+ individuals. In states with conservative leadership, new laws and executive orders emerged during the Trump years that targeted transgender youth, restricted curriculum related to sexual orientation and gender identity, or expanded religious exemptions to allow for LGBTQ+ discrimination in education and healthcare. While not always directly coordinated with the federal government, these state actions often mirrored the Trump administration's tone, one of silence or indirect condemnation, giving cover to anti-LGBTQ+ initiatives across the country. Yet not all the long-term impacts are regressive. Ironically, the lack of federal support during the Trump years galvanized a renewed sense of activism and solidarity within LGBTQ communities. Organizations that had grown accustomed to incremental progress during the Obama era found themselves re-energized in opposition. New advocacy coalitions formed, fundraising surged, and local-level organizing expanded rapidly. Activists realized that progress was not linear, and that rights, once assumed secure, could be stripped quietly, if not vigilantly defended. This resurgence of grassroots activism bore electoral consequences. LGBTQ turnout in the 2020 election reached historic levels, and LGBTQ+ candidates achieved unprecedented victories. Sarah McBride became the first openly transgender state senator in U.S. history. Mondaire Jones and Richie Torres, both openly gay and black, were elected to Congress. These victories signaled that while the Trump administration may have stifled federal recognition, it could not suppress the political mobilization of LGBTQ Americans. In fact, its actions may have accelerated it internationally. The Trump administration's approach to pride and LGBTQ+ rights had diplomatic repercussions. Allies in Europe and North America questioned whether the U.S. could still lead on human rights issues. The decision to deny embassies permission to fly the pride flag was particularly controversial. Diplomats and human rights leaders in countries with ongoing LGBTQ persecution viewed the move as a betrayal of the U.S.'s historic stance as a defender of minority rights. In the global arena, America's moral authority was diminished, giving authoritarian regimes greater rhetorical ammunition to resist LGBTQ reforms. From a governance perspective, the Trump administration's treatment of Pride Month also set a precedent for how presidential administrations can influence cultural narratives through silence alone. While past presidents may have differed on policy, they often used the presidency as a unifying platform to affirm diverse identities. Trump, in contrast, redefined presidential visibility not as a tool for inclusion, but as a means of exclusion, through omission. This strategy, subtle, calculated, and symbolic, offers future administrations a playbook for advancing ideological goals without overt confrontation. Nevertheless, experts caution against viewing the Trump era as an isolated anomaly. Rather, they argue it revealed latent fractures within American society and government, fractures that can be exploited when accountability fades. The erosion of institutional norms, such as pride proclamations or inclusive agency policies, demonstrated how easily progress can be undone when vigilance wanes. For many, the lesson is clear. Civil rights victories must be defended continually, not merely celebrated, as the Biden administration moved swiftly to restore many of the protections and recognitions rolled back during Trump's term. Questions remain about durability. Can progress be made permanent, or is each advance subject to reversal with each electoral swing? Legal scholars argue that without comprehensive federal legislation, such as the Equality Act, LGBTQ+ rights remain vulnerable to the whims of executive authority. Symbolism matters, but so does codification. In this light, the Trump administration's silent war on Pride Month may be seen not just as a chapter of resistance, but as a case study in how quickly cultural and political tides can shift. It underscores the fragility of inclusion and the necessity of constant civic engagement, even and especially when the fight is quiet. The Trump administration's silent treatment of Pride Month was not a coincidence, but a reflection of deeper ideological commitments. Through omission, policy, and judicial appointments, it quietly redrew the federal government's stance on LGBTQ+ identity, leaving behind a legacy still under active repair. If you found this deep dive informative and believe in the importance of unbiased reporting on civil rights, consider supporting our work by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with others who care about truth, history, and accountability. Stay tuned for more documentary-style breakdowns of the moments and movements shaping modern America.